I'm Sarah Randazzo. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal in Los Angeles. I'm a 2008 UCLA graduate, and at UCLA, I worked at the Bruin as a copy editor and did a little writing for A&E and sports. And I'm excited to have Robert Faturechi here, a fellow 2008 graduate, to talk about his Pulitzer Prize winning series and other things he's worked on in his career. So Robert and two colleagues at ProPublica won a Pulitzer Prize in national reporting this year for a series that delved into two crashes of Navy battleships into commercial cargo ships that killed 17 people, and a third deadly in-air crash of two Marine aircraft that killed 6 more. And the investigation, for those who haven't read it yet, is truly stunning, visually and through the whole package of illustrations and videos, and the story itself really just shows how well accidents did occur from those on the ship and aircraft. There was very large institutional problems at the highest levels of the Navy and Marines that really contributed to the crashes, including grueling schedules and overworked sailors and pilots that left people little room for sleep and training, and faulty equipment that was constantly breaking down, and a chain of command that really ignored a lot of the systems as they were falling apart. So before we get to the series, first wanted to just talk with Robert a little bit about his career. He joined ProPublica in 2014, and before that worked at the Los Angeles Times, where he also did some good investigations, including work that helped lead to reforms in the jail systems and the criminal convictions of sheriff's deputies and the resignation of the sheriff. Before that, he worked at the Sacramento Bee. And Robert, I wanted to start with, we graduated in 2008. There was obviously not a global pandemic, but there was a pretty bad recession happening. I remember layoffs happening in newsrooms across the country. It was a pretty bad time to be entering media. I know you got caught up in some downsizing at the Sacramento Bee. What can you share about those early years? Did you ever waver on wanting to be in journalism? And what advice do you have for those graduating in the pandemic now from what we went through back in 2008?
Yeah, so I think you're right that it was a very similar situation. If I recall correctly, I think I had just finished my summer internship at the Seattle Times when the financial meltdown really started. It was the weekend after, I think, and it was a tough way to enter the industry, and my first real job was at the Sacramento Bee, like you mentioned, and by that point they had already gone through several rounds of layoffs. So I got to a newsroom that was depleted and pretty demoralized, and that was sort of my first real experience with being staff, and it wasn't a great experience. It was a tough way to start your career, and then, like you mentioned, I think 6-7 months into my first real job, having moved up to Sacramento for it, I got the tap on the shoulder and told that I was going to be part of the, big round of layoffs. And that was, shattering. I thought my career was over. I started looking into law school. I studied for the LSAT. I took the LSAT.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But in the meantime, I actually had, I lined up a fellowship, through MetPro, which has been in the news a lot lately, actually, for not good reasons. But I got my foot in the door at the LA Times that way. And, when I was there, I think it was being run much better at I took a few months after I got there because I'd been studying for it, but it finally made sense to me, to be in this career, with the sacrifices that it comes with. I immediately sort of loved what I was doing. The fellowship turned into a job, and I was almost immediately able to do some good investigative work on LA County Sheriff's Department and problems in its jails. And I sort of, began to make a name for way and develop a reputation. And, but that sort of feeling of having been laid off first job within a matter of months, like, I still think about it. I think people who kind of are kind of always a little nervous, whether it makes sense to be or not, and are kind of, always sort of fearing the worst. But, it kind of keeps you hungry and, keeps you working hard.
Yeah. And so one of the students who wrote in questions ahead of time wanted to know what the biggest obstacle was you faced in your career. Would you say it was going through that layoff, or is there anything else you would mention?
Yeah, I think it would definitely be going through that layoff. I mean, it just in the moment, when you're first starting out your career and you start with sort of like what you think is a a layoff shouldn't be a black mark, but when you're going through it, it feels that way. I just sort of thought I'd never recover, and that I wouldn't be able to get another job, and that was the end of my career in journalism. And it almost was. I was preparing to go to law school. So in my case, I'm thankful that I didn't, and I stuck with journalism, and I've been very happy with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever wish that you became a lawyer?
I think it's pretty cool that federal prosecutors kind of do what we do, except they have subpoena power and it's illegal to lie to them. I'm often jealous of that, but no, I'm happy.
Nice. And so now onto your series. It's one of these, when I read it, it's one of these topics where I thought, like, how have I never heard of these crashes? And I feel like a lot of people are probably in the same situation, and at first I didn't really understand the gravity, and then you read it and think, okay, these are huge naval battleships that are protecting our country. They're going on secret missions in the South China Seas. You think they should be these high-tech, sleek, super fancy operations, and somehow twice they crashed into slow-moving cargo ships in the middle of the ocean. And reading the series, you just got such a sense of all of these mostly very young, people in their 20s, just doing the best they can. And it was really just a stunning look at our military and things that I think a lot of people just don't think about in their everyday lives. And so I'm curious first how you got involved in this series. I know there were 3 of you on it. And at the time, how much had already been written about these crashes? And I know it can be hard sometimes to start something that already has some coverage. And so what were you guys hoping to accomplish that was different than the coverage that had already been out there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people forgot that these accidents happened. The first one happened, and that was odd, and then weeks later, a second one happened. But this was all in the very beginning of the Trump administration. There's obviously a lot going on, and I think that the way the news cycle moves these days, you just sort of move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But the way the sort of genesis of it was one of my teammates on the story, T. Christian Miller. He got sort of a leak of documents that related to the first accident, the USS Fitzgerald. And so, it related only to that one crash. These were sort of confidential internal documents. But so it was a massive amount of material, right? So immediately ProPublica, assembled a team. They brought Megan Rose on, who's our other teammate, and myself. And so we, started out trying to tell the story of the Fitzgerald. But what we also wanted to do was to, look at the second accident, but also, more importantly, go up the chain of command and see, what went wrong institutionally to allow this kind of thing to happen. Was it a fluke, just sort of bad luck, to inexplicable accidents in a matter of weeks? Or had there been warnings, up and down the chain of command? Were there deficiencies that high-ranking commanders were aware of and didn't fix? And that would obviously be a much more powerful story. And so we started, reporting it out. We started knocking on doors. We were constantly traveling, DC, San Diego. I went to Japan. We were all over the place trying to reach people who would have known and who would have had documents that would have reflected how high up the culpability went. And immediately it was sort of amazing. High-ranking people were going on background with us. Sometimes on the record, we were getting documents, and we took it all the way up to the Secretary of the Navy. The warnings had gone up that high and had been ignored. And then there was, we also, looked at other parts of the military. So most significantly, we looked at a Marine Corps crash, and an aviation crash also in the Pacific. Two Marine Corps aircraft collided. 6 Marines were killed. And what we discovered there was, again, the sort of public investigation laid the blame at the feet of the squadron themselves, sort of described them as cowboys who were abusing prescription drugs and sort of were nonchalant about safety. I was able to get a pretty explosive, confidential, A series of memos, but then also B, sort of an investigation called a safety investigation that, is criminal to release. You're supposed to keep it within the Marine Corps. What that showed is that there were all sorts of very serious mechanical deficiencies, training deficiencies that, the highest ranking people knew about and they did nothing about. The most shocking one to me was, everyone's equipped, aviators are equipped with location beacons so that if they crash and are forced to sort of eject and land in the sea, that rescue planes and ships can find them. This beacon goes off.
Yeah.
And the Marine Corps knew that these beacons, failed once they hit the water. There had been 2 previous accidents where these beacons had failed. The squadron had tried to replace them with sort of an off-the-shelf type of beacon that you could get off of Amazon. Soon before the crash happened, the Marine Corps discovered that they had these things and they took them away because they were unauthorized, and they sent them out with these faulty beacons. And one of the guys, evidence indicates he was probably alive for about 10 hours and they just couldn't find him, floating on the water, probably alive, possibly conscious, certainly conscious for the initial period. And they ended up stopped, an hour waiting. So, that's just one example. Our series was filled with tons of examples like this, where high-level people knew about serious problems, did nothing about it. And then most significantly, when they're telling this story to the public of what went wrong, and when they're telling the loved ones of those who died what went wrong, a lot of this stuff got left out until our stories were published.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so terrible for the family members who had to think that their loved one was to blame or was going rogue, did something they weren't supposed to, when it wasn't that at all, in a lot of cases. Yeah, that's tough. And so with these document releases, so your colleague got the 13,000 page document. Was he already looking into the crash and seeking it out, or did the story start because someone just decided to send it to him? I'm always intrigued by people who leak documents and kind of, which direction the motivation goes in.
So I can't get too far in detail about that. But T was sort of poking around about how the military justice system worked. So he attended one of these hearings that related to the first crash. There was some initial poking around going on before that first set of documents.
Got it. And then how do you even look through that many documents to find what you need? I saw at the bottom of the story kind of a big team of people from ProPublica that had also been involved. How do you divide up that labor and that number of documents?
So going through those documents, I would say me, T, and Megan, we all probably had eyes on 80-90% of them. Maybe there's 10%, 15% that only one of us looked at just because we were running out of time, to publish these stories. But it was, and it's not like it's easy reading. I had never covered the military before. When you start out reading these documents, you get through a full page and you just realize you understood nothing.
Oh, no.
There's nothing that you understood. Everything is an acronym.
Oh my God.
Everything has some jargony phrase that it does not need to be this kind of jargon. It could be clear. So it's like a lot of deciphering beyond just being really voluminous. Once you get through, and we developed really good sources, right? So I'd constantly be texting people, hey, what does this mean? What's the significance of this? So you're constantly sort of vetting your understanding of what these documents say. But it was tough. I mean, it took 18 months for a reason. Three
Got it.
full-time reporters. It was really tough.
Yeah. And were they organized? Did you have them electronically, or are you sitting with piles of papers all around your office?
Mainly electronically, and we would, we'd sort of have like a series of, so we'd have them all in sort of like a Google folder, right? And then we would have sort of notes documents for the various, types of documents that we were looking at, and we would all sort of be leaving notes throughout, copying and pasting significant portions. But then what you're left with is sort of like, well, you thought you had condensed it, but it's thousands of pages. So now you literally have hundreds of pages of notes. So then for each of these stories, and these were like 10, 15,000 word stories sometimes, there was a whole process of organizing your notes, right? And that was typically the hardest part, like these were hard stories to tell. So like the hardest part was sort of the organizing of the notes and the outlining. And then at that point, it was just sort of writing off of that, but we would really try to sort of map everything out before we started writing.
Yeah. And then I saw you guys did kind of 3D visualizations and some really great visuals. Were those all people who already worked at ProPublica, and that you were working with graphics teams and illustrators and everything from the get-go, or did that come on the back end?
So most significantly, the designer who did Snowfall, which I don't know if current Daily Bruin people would know about it, but
probably not. You're right. What year was that now?
Gosh,
God,
in college, so it must have been.
It was that long ago.
Was it right after college? I don't know. It's probably around like 2008 or something.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, it's a kind of legendary New York Times story that was one of the first, I don't know what they call it, but immersive stories where you'd scroll and there'd be huge pictures and then words, and it kind of told the story in a way that now is very common, but was pretty new when that came out.
Yeah, if you go and look at it now, like, it's not impressive at all.
I should look.
Yeah. It's like something that the New York Times would do on any given day, but like at the time, it was like, you're totally revolutionary. And so, that designer, who obviously has also developed his skills, and was able to put together this first multimedia package for us, he was able to recreate, how the ships were moving as they crashed, what it sort of looked like, inside of the ship. So he did incredible work. And then for the Marine Corps, video, we did a short documentary. Our video team on staff led that, and they were actually coming out with me to Billings as I was reporting this, out to Florida. So they were, sort of, it was kind of a hand-in-hand process where they were working with me. But that was almost entirely in-house. We brought in an illustrator and sort of a 3D graphics person who was not in-house. But it was a mix of the two. But there were a whole team of ProPublica people working on this, from engagement to design to video. The institution really threw all its resources at it.
Yeah. And so you mentioned going on interviews all over the world and, knocking on people's doors. And I've just been thinking, during this pandemic, how reporting is limited. We can't travel as much anymore. But do you think about the challenges and investigations that maybe aren't being done now or are more difficult now that we're all stuck at home? Or do you think, given how normal it is now to do Zoom calls and phone calls, that you still could have done this type of series if you weren't able to fly all over the world for these interviews?
I think we can, I can definitively say, like, we would not have been able to do this series. It really required sort of, oftentimes, sort of knocking on someone's door, being a body that they had to say no to, a human being in front of them, which is much harder than a phone call or like a Zoom. It's easy to sort of click, hang up. But when you show up in person, and some of the documents that we got were very sensitive, and a lot of that happened in person. I think it would have been tough to do this project. But that's not to say that, like, you can't do good investigative reporting under the current conditions. My biggest story this year was I'd been looking for sort of congressional corruption stories anyway, right. And then, COVID hit. And so there had been a story on NPR about how one of the senators from North Carolina, Richard Burr, had told sort of an insider members only club that COVID was going to be much worse than the Trump administration was describing. There were going to be travel disruptions and school closures. And because I'd already been sort of looking at those forms that are all posted online, these financial disclosure forms, from the comfort of my garage where I work,
Right.
I sort of looked up his form and saw that he had done a massive stock sale, before the market crash, right? And that was sort of a shorter term thing, right? But it was investigative in nature and did not require going anywhere. I did it all from, my garage. But a certain kind of work, until we can sort of travel more freely, will be really difficult. And I do have colleagues that are traveling, and doing really good work as a result. But obviously, it's very limited now. I haven't traveled, since this struck. It's harder, it's to be able to see people in person.
Yeah. And when you're doing an investigation, how important is it to you to think about the impact the story is going to have? Are you just hoping to get the story out and have more people know about it, or are you thinking, I want something to change? I want Congress to get involved. I guess, how much do you think about the impact, and how happy were you with the impact that did come from this series?
So, like as journalists, I guess, there different journalists have different perspectives on this. My perspective is I don't think we should be sort of advocating for a particular type of impact or a particular outcome. Even sometimes when that outcome is sort of obvious, right? I think it's our job to sort of investigate and get the news out, and do so as clearly and compellingly as possible. But I do think it's fine, and it's part of ProPublica's mission. We want our stories to have impact, right? And I don't think that's controversial to say, right? You don't want your story to just sort of be read by a small number of people and people who don't have decision-making authority, right? You want it to get to the people who matter and people who can do something about it, right? And use that information in a constructive way. So in the case of our military project, I was pretty pleased with the impact. There were multiple congressional hearings as a result of our work. The House Armed Services Committee, several members, cited our work. They were angry about our work. They brought top Marine Corps and Navy officials to the hearings, and they really grilled them hard. The Marine Corps actually, I think 2 weeks ago, put out a report that sort of echoed a lot of the findings of our investigation.
That must have felt good.
Yeah, they were quite harsh with the quality of the last investigation, and I'm not sure if that would have happened without our stories, right? And it is very, they've begun to make changes that would make these kinds of disasters less likely to happen. Oh, sorry, that was my dog. Let me just close that.
No problem.
Sorry. That would make these disasters less likely to happen again. And we've heard from the families of those who were killed, and they have said that it's meant a lot for them that these accidents that were not getting enough scrutiny are now, and that the Navy and the Marine Corps are being forced to sort of reckon with the deficiencies of the past. And I think everyone hopes that this sort of senseless loss of life is less likely to happen again.
Yeah. And obviously we're talking today because the work won a Pulitzer. Not to sound cynical, I don't know if that's the right word, but I guess, how much are awards ever in your mind when you're doing big investigations?
So, I think they're nice because they give the work more credibility. I know for a fact that at the Pentagon, at the highest levels of the Navy and the Marine Corps, they heard when we won a Pulitzer. And I think that sort of forces them to take the work even more seriously than they had before. So I think that's really nice. Like you said, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation, right, we've done other interviews about our work as a result. So it gets the stories more exposure. And I think it's also just sort of really good for our institution, right? Being able to, most people have not heard of ProPublica still. So being able to sort of have the credibility of a Pulitzer Prize is sort of great for fundraising, but B, also when I call people, they're less likely to say ProPublica who, what?
Yeah.
I get a lot.
Right.
They're more likely to have heard of us and to take us seriously. That's sort of one of the things I miss about being at the LA Times. When I call and say I'm from the LA Times, there's sort of like a note of fear, and they would sort of take me, earnestly. And like that's not. It's more and more the case at ProPublica, but especially when I first started, it was just they thought we were some blog, right? So the fact that we've sort of established ourselves and continue to establish ourselves. I don't know what number Pulitzer this is, but there have been multiple now. It's good for an institution that I think is doing a lot of good work.
Definitely. And I'm going to look at the reader questions for a second. And for anyone in the audience, there's a Q&A button on the bottom if you want to write in. Jay from DB Sports 1992 asks, were the Navy sailors mad or happy with your reporting?
Well, it's not like we did sort of a scientific poll, right? So I can't definitively say, but the response that we did get, and we got a ton of response, overwhelmingly, they were extremely gratified that the kind of conditions that they were living and working in were being exposed. After that accidents occurred, the Navy promised a whole series of reforms, and were making a lot of claims about how well they were implementing them, and we shot a lot of holes in that, and they were thrilled to see that. Same goes with the Marine Corps. That's not to say that, we did get emails here or there from folks who, thought we got some detail wrong, right? And they were, most of the time they're wrong. I don't think we had any corrections, definitely not any significant corrections.
I didn't see any when I was reading through.
It's like, it's an audience that is very detail oriented. And, there were a lot of high level people who did not come out looking great in these stories. And, a lot of those folks were not happy with the stories, but that's sort of to be expected.
Yeah, you don't really want those people to be happy, probably.
If you're doing
it right.
You want them to think it was accurate, right? And again, our stories were not challenged in any significant way. So
So I want to talk a bit about your time at the Daily Bruin, since that's what brings all of us together. So I still remember going into remind me if I'm getting these details wrong, but going into our senior year, you'd been studying abroad, right? And then you wanted to run for editor-in-chief. And so I still remember there was the interview, where the candidates, the forum where the candidates give their spiels, and then all the staff, vote on who it's going to be. And I still remember people being outraged of, you haven't even been here for the last year and you think you can come in and be editor. And so needless to say, Robert lost the election, but he then became investigations editor, which was that a position you created? That was the first time that existed, right? Or had it been around before?
No, it hadn't. And your description, I think back on that run as like embarrassingly arrogant. I was abroad for like half the year and then like not very involved for the other half. And I ran on a platform of everything's terrible and only I can fix it.
I forgot that part of why people were mad. That makes sense.
So the staff was very wise not to elect me because I was a jerk. But yeah, the editor-in-chief who did win, I think it was her idea. I don't remember for sure. I don't think it was my idea. It was her idea. Sort of, thought up of, one of the things I said was we're going to do more investigative reporting, right? So her idea was to sort of create kind of a section for that and an editor for that. And she picked me to do that, which was great. I think I would have probably been a not very good editor-in-chief. But I did run that section, and I got to sort of be kind of like a player coach and like do investigative reporting and investigative editing. And I think the position still exists today. It did, at least.
Hope so.
And out of that position came sort of like my first investigative story, which
Right.
without it, I don't think I would have ever gotten an internship or a job. I'd been applying to like 100 internships every summer and being rejected from all of them until
Wow.
that story. And it was, at the School of Dentistry, specifically their orthodontics division. I think they accept 6 people every year, 8 people every year. And we showed through internal emails and interviews with people in that school that they were reserving slots every year for the relatives of donors. And basically, joking in these emails about, so-and-so's son applied, I got him in, I told him not to mention his board scores to anyone. Like all this was sort of written out in emails. So like it was my first taste of like really good, sort of really exciting, investigative reporting.
Yeah.
And I was sort of hooked after that. And I kind of, prior to that, I sort of imagined myself as like writerly, and I wanted to like write beautiful features and like,
I think every college student thinks that. Yeah.
yeah. And then I realized like, no, like I like this job because it's like, like you can dig in and expose things and,
Yeah.
and so like that
Yeah.
kind of set the path for my whole career, and like that experience, I really credit for, getting me here.
Wow. So do you think about if you'd won that EIC election and not done the investigation? I don't know. I mean, could everything have been different?
The Daily Bruin probably would have been much worse. I would have probably been in law school. So
Yeah.
good that I lost. Also, I probably would have still been an arrogant jerk. So that I was reprimanded in that one.
Nice. Yeah. And I remember when the college admission scandal broke last year, I think I saw you tweeted like, hey, I wrote about something similar, more than 10 years ago now. And so in a way, it was almost a precursor to this scandal, in recent years.
Yeah. And there had been sort of similar, abuses at public schools before it too. I think it's something that, it just pops up every few years. So.
Yeah. And so some students who had written in ahead of time, one wanted to know how you'd describe the difference between the Daily Bruin and a professional newsroom. And I have to add that I still have not worked at a newsroom that has a better editing system than the Daily Bruin had. At the Wall Street Journal, we edit over email and Google Doc, which like when I think back on the Daily Bruin, platform we had to log into stories and make notes and everything, it's funny to think I haven't had something like that. But yeah, how would you compare a professional newsroom and the Bruin?
I mean, I don't know how you feel. I feel like it was actually like really good training. Like right down to like the sort of personalities, the common personalities in the different sections. I feel like that's mirrored in professional newsrooms. Like the pace of it. I never went to journalism school, and I don't feel like I really missed out as a result. I feel like the Daily Bruin is like a good replacement for going to journalism school.
Absolutely.
A much cheaper one.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously, like it's different, right? You're like college students, and like you're ostensibly going to class and studying, and like you're all sort of peers, and there are no real bosses and that kind of thing. But as similar as it can be in a college context, I thought it was.
Yeah. And another student wanted to know what it's like to work on a story for so long. You mentioned this was an 18-month investigation. Do you ever become desensitized to the topic, and how do you stay motivated when you're with something for that long a period?
It's tough. So, like when I first, at the LA Times, I was like a beat reporter who did investigative reporting. And so, being at ProPublica was the first time I was sort of like an investigative reporter, like sort of only doing those kinds of stories. And like, it's hard to figure that out. Like you go through sort of crazy ups and downs. Like, every time you get a story, you're like on top of the world, right? And as you're working on it, like the process is such that you're, initially you think you have this incredible story, and then you're sort of like vetting the story and you're thinking, is this even a story? And then so you feel terrible again, right? But you do more reporting, and most of the time you figure out it is a story, it is a great story. And then you publish and you feel amazing for, I don't know, a day, 2 days, like maybe a week. And then like you're looking for your next story, and you I still, every time, like feel like I'm never going to find a story again. And like this last story,
Yeah.
final one of my career. And like, sometimes that lasts like weeks, like, and that's like a really tough period to go through. So like, in this case, we were on like one subject matter for 18 months. The sort of cycle I just described was sort of more drawn out because each story took a few months. But there were periods where we didn't have anything good going and we were sort of like working to find that. There were definitely periods where we were tired of the subject matter, or, there are periods where you're sort of wondering, like, there's so much going on, with the Trump administration, are we off topic right now? Is this the best use of resources, right? And then, in the end, it sort of became clear that like not all investigative reporting can be focused on, the current administration, right? There's a lot going on in other parts of the government, and other parts of the country, and there are a lot of good stories that are being ignored as a result. And I think this probably was one of them, right? So, a lot of ups and downs, though.
Yeah. And someone in the audience is asking, is there anything you wish you'd known when you started your journalism career?
Is there anything I wish I would have known? So, like, I feel like, and maybe I still feel this way at times, like, when you're starting out as a reporter, like, you sort of assume that, like, all the other reporters in the newsroom who have more experience than you are kind of, like, experts in everything that they're reporting on, right? But, like, the nature of this job is that, like, no one's an expert on anything when they're starting out a story, right? And, like, it's okay to sort of not know what you're doing or not know the subject matter. Like, that's part of the process. And, like, you should not beat yourself up over that, right? Like, you should a little bit, because it motivates you to kind of like work hard and like get a grasp of things, right? But like, that's sort of, it's like that for everyone. And then the other thing is, the cycle I mentioned, like the more I've realized that this like cycle exists, like, like when I'm on the like looking for a story period, like I don't beat myself up as much, which I think is helpful.
Yeah. Someone else asks, how do you think the knocking on doors type of sourcing is different than emails and phone calls? And how do you approach that style of sourcing to get what you're looking for when you're trying to physically get in front of someone?
So, I mean, first I would do the hierarchy of, like emailing someone is probably the worst way to do it. Sometimes there's no other choice, right? But emailing or a LinkedIn message, and I do that. Phone calls are even better. Showing up in person is the best, as a general rule. It helps to come into it really informed as you can be, like having the lingo down, sort of having in mind a reason that, beyond you being there and you being a human being in front of them that they have to deal with, giving them sort of a reason to talk to as they slam the door, right? So like knowing the thing that that they're going to want to elaborate on, or they're going to want to, share the other side of the story on, like sort of going in there with a game plan in mind of giving them reasons to want to talk, right? And then another thing that, is it's sort of a line, but it's true too, right, is, like letting them know that, like, if you didn't deeply care about the story, and you weren't deeply invested in the story and telling the story fully and fairly, like you wouldn't have driven there or flown there and shown up in person, right? Like your existence in front of them is proof that you want to do right by this story. And then if they're open to it, right, the sort of the nature of this kind of reporting, right, is that you, depend on anonymous sources, but like each time you're sort of developing that reputation anew. Like you can't give them a list of references of people you haven't burned in the past. Right. So like something I tell them is, like, you don't know me yet. Like I'm not going to burn you because that's that would be the wrong thing to do. But you should also know that it's like the self-interested thing to not do, because if I were to burn you, my reputation is ruined, my news organization's reputation is ruined. Like, so like, I'm not going to do it because it's the right thing to do, but like, I'm also not going to do it. Like, if you don't trust that I'm sort of a moral reporter, like, I'm also not going to do it because I'd be screwing myself. And that's an argument that sort of works for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because it's true, but you know, it is sort of like, you got to make the case, and you don't have much time to make the case.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my strategy.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think we're running a little short on time. We'll do a couple more questions. What's some of the best editing advice you've ever gotten, or advice from an editor that you've ever gotten?
So the showing up in person thing is something I've learned from editors. I hope my editors aren't watching. I'm at a loss. I mean, I've had really good editors, and I mean, you know, like I think sometimes we get sort of, you know, like with a complicated story, you know, like we get too sort of maybe bogged down in the details, and especially in the top, right? When you've sort of been immersed in one story for a long time. And like, you got to sort of remind yourself that like the reader is coming at it totally fresh. And a lot of the things that for you now are sort of, you know, well known by insiders that, you know, like you think is not the sort of most exciting thing anymore, to your average reader is still going to be the most exciting thing. And you can get to sort of the minutia later. And you can sort of worry about kind of litigating those details later. You know, like you've got to sort of not get in the way of the story up top. I don't know if that's like too small of a piece of advice, but like that's a big one.
No, that's
showing up in person is another.
Yeah, no, that's very true, because I feel like when you've been with a story that long, you tend to lose sight over what's interesting about it anymore. And yeah, like you say, the reader knows nothing, but to you, things are no longer interesting because you just assume them as knowledge. But yeah, it can help to have an editor or someone else say, no, this detail will be really riveting and people haven't heard this. And yeah.
And I mean, so oftentimes, like when you think your editor is totally wrong, like couldn't be wronger. Like I hate to say it, like they're right. Like I said, it's always the case. But like, for example, I joke about it with my editor now, like the top of the Marine Corps story, like I thought this other version of the top was like so much better, so much better, so much better. And like he, you know, kindly but steadfastly like refused to budge. And like, you know, I think the reception that story got and everything that's come since is sort of like proved his case, unfortunately. So like, you know, you're not always right, especially when you've been like, you know, totally in something for way too long.
Got it. Well, to wrap up, I mean, was there anything else about the series you wanted to mention, or anything you can say about what's next? I know you've been doing, you mentioned some of your current projects. I know if you have some new big investigation, you're not going to tell us about it, but you know, what should we look out for next from you?
You know, I'm still just sort of plugging away. I mean, like, you know, like you said, I can't really talk about future stories, but you know, like a lot of ProPublica is looking at, you know, obviously like the new reality that we're in, financially, you know, with the bailout, and, you know, health-wise with the virus. So, you know, I am doing stories sort of in and around that. And I'm also working on one that's not at all related to that, which I think we still need to be doing, you know, even now. You know, like sort of like a thing I'd mention is like anyone who is sort of, if there is anyone who's watching this who's sort of like interested in journalism and is at UCLA now, you know, like you really, really should work at the Daily Bruin. Like it is the sort of best training you can get. You know, I adjunct for grad school, and like, you know, like I would still say that the Daily Bruin is like better training, and it's free, and you might even get paid, and like you should do it, and it'll be sort of like the best memories you have from college. You know, I really do credit that experience, like those 4 years or, you know, 3.5 years, you know, like with giving me the skills I needed and sort of giving me the motivation I needed and the love for journalism to sort of continue it. So,
Nice.
You know,
Good plug. That leads us well into Lawrence Ma, our president's going to just give a little plug for the Daily Bruin Alumni Network. But Robert, congratulations on your Pulitzer. And yeah, it's really great for the Daily Bruin to have a Pulitzer winner also, like, you know, the same that's good for ProPublica. And yeah, we're all excited to have you in our ranks, and thanks for doing this.
thanks for having me.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Robert and Sarah. Adding my congratulations to Robert on this tremendous honor. And I'd like to also mention Courtney Khan Alcantara, who is also a winner this year of a Pulitzer. She, of the Washington Post, was on a climate change project called the 2C Project, and she was a designer on the project that also won a prize this year. I am a board member of the DBAM board with Sarah, and a little bit of an update on where we are this year. And despite the pandemic, you know, we carry on. And if the students are putting out the paper, and I think the alumni can go ahead and soldier on as well. I'm very happy to see what I think is one of our inaugural Daily Bruin scholars on the call tonight. And indeed, we're underway with our second batch of scholarship for the fall. We would like to award 5 scholarships of $2,000 each to student staffers pursuing careers in journalism and media and related fields. And I would argue that these are essential, you know, for these times. For sure. And so you will see us on social media in terms of our fundraising, and we're about 8% right now, a little bit of a slow start, but you know, hopefully by October we'll get there and raise the funds for the second class of the Daily Bruin Scholars. We'd also like to encourage alums to network. You know, Sarah is our editor of the quarterly newsletter, and we'd love to hear from you with your class notes. And we will be resuming our alumni critique program, where a couple of times a month we'll invite, you know, we would like alums to read a production of the paper and just provide a memo and feedback for the students. Back in my day, I had no email, I had no Twitter. I mean, nobody wrote to the editors about what I wrote. So these days, you guys get feedback, and now alums can also participate in that process with doing a whole memo. And I just want to mention that although the reunion in the fall is not going to happen on campus this year for obvious reasons, we are still going to try to do another virtual event. And we are going to invite the senior management, the top editors of the Bruin, to give us a State of the Bruin virtual talk, much like this one. And for this group of editors, I must say that this must be an academic year and production year like no other. And I'd be very interested and encourage all of you to join us online again. Lastly, I just want to thank Robert and Sarah again for a terrific event, and also acknowledge Justin Siller of the UCLA Alumni Association, who set us up with this virtual room. And I want to wish everybody well, take good care, and we'll be back at Kirkhoff Hall soon.
Thanks, Lawrence. And I just want to add, if anyone has class notes or things they ever want to tell us about, you can email me at randazzo, my name's up on the screen, at ucla.edu. Thanks to some alumni gift, my UCLA email still routes to my Gmail. So randazzo at ucla.edu, and you can, send us anything that that's crossing your mind that you want to tell us about. So thanks again, Robert. And that should do it.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Bye.